All right, to work on romanticism, I want to add a little bit about Napoleon and the political and social context in the first part, and then we'll get into the real spirit of romanticism and the aspects of the visual art as well as the other arts like music and literature in the second part. So to kind of situate ourselves, we're looking at Europe and America as well, so both sides of the Atlantic, from 1800 to 1870, and yet, as you'll find with each new chapter, we always have to keep looking back at the previous century, so there's going to be a couple that are actually 18th century works on the slide list. So here's a glimpse at kind of the very turn of the century, Napoleonic Europe. That is Europe affected by this, in some people's opinion, upstart French officer who rises to the rank of emperor and takes over, as you can see, in green, orange, and pink, basically all of Europe, with the United Kingdom, England, to the north, Russia to the east, as his main rivals who do eventually defeat him. So what we have here is kind of a pan-French European culture. We have kind of the passing of the torch from the great Habsburg Empire, both Spain and Austria, to France in terms of where political power, cultural power is seated. So essentially, Napoleon succeeds where so many others have failed in history to, in essence, recreate the Roman Empire, but not centered in Rome, centered in Paris, in his home country. And in terms of how he wanted to display this new power, both cultural and political, of course, painting was a big part of that, just like it has been for every king or emperor in Europe for several centuries. And Jacques-Louis David, who had once been a Jacobin partisan artist during the Revolution and the Reign of Terror, has found a way to survive. He is now court painter to Napoleon himself, and his students also receive commissions from Napoleon. This one is perhaps one of the largest today in the Louvre in Paris. The Coronation of Napoleon is its title. What is actually going on, as you can perhaps tell here, is Napoleon himself is crowning his Empress, Josephine. So the coronation of Napoleon has essentially already happened, and this painting, this composition, is an expression of his power not only over the lords and ladies to the left, but the clergy that are to the right. So we can kind of split this painting almost down the middle with a very important person here. This is Napoleon's mother looking on, and this is where David really executes his skill as a court painter. She wasn't really there. So David was given explicit instructions for what this painting ought to be, and he essentially recreated and created an event that did and did not happen. It is political propaganda at its best, where we can look at left and right of his lovely mother and see his full domain, the political and cultural life of France and Europe, and the Catholic Church. What is also distinct is David has let go of his pure Greek style that was so evident in works like the Oath of the Horatii, where we have stark, almost theater stage-like lighting Nothing else to really crowd the composition, just these lovely three arches separating out our three main groups of people. Father in the center, sons taking the oath on the left, and women and children on the right, bow down in grief over the sacrifice that the family, the Horatii, are about to make for the Republic. In terms of mimicking the Roman Empire and mimicking the Romans, you could think of Napoleon as a Caesar. He really takes what was a republic in trouble, where there were many different factions at war with each other, and unites it. He takes it from republic back to monarchy, for sure, but under his leadership, the leadership of a general, of a person for the people, or at least that's what he wanted to be seen as. So a student of David here, Antoine Jean Gros, shows us Napoleon visiting his troops and other plague-stricken people at Jaffa, and that is a main port in what is modern-day Israel. So the other aspect of Napoleon doing as the Romans do, he conquers eastward. He has a campaign in Syria, down in Egypt. So this time period that we're looking at, the turn of the 18th to 19th centuries, colonialism is in full swing. You can see perhaps in this arch up here, the tricolor of France up on a promontory. So this is essentially the French staking claim, taking over a part of territory that at the time was occupied by the Ottoman or Turkish Empire, a place that was at one point in time occupied by the Greeks, by the Romans. The Holy Land, what is today Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, has for millennia been changing hands. So Napoleon is not a new person in terms of conquering or colonizing this area of the world. He's not necessarily being a novel commander in that sense. He is duplicating what his great idols, like the Caesars, or like Alexander the Great, did in the ancient world. This just happens to be 1804, the modern world, where we have this meeting of East and West, but in a way that's very definitely not objective and empirical. The sense of Enlightenment investigation tends to go away when the Europeans meet Eastern cultures. And what takes over, what clouds the objectivity of the Europeans is this kind of fetishization, this fantasy world of what the East is compared to the West, compared to Europe. So Napoleon, in his mind, is a new Caesar, a new Augustus, a new conqueror. He even at one point has a very Roman title, consul, which essentially is the leader of the Republic, and then later Emperor of France, assuming his more absolute political role. And so it would fit his style and his propaganda not to necessarily stray too far from the neoclassical style that we see in Jefferson's United States, that we see from the earlier days of the French Revolution. So he builds basically a Roman temple for his soldiers, La Madeleine, which has now become a Catholic church, and perhaps most famous, the Arc de Triomphe, in a very centralized place in Paris, if you've ever been, which is a direct imitation of the arches that many Caesars, many Roman emperors would erect to commemorate a great victory, or even just the building of a new Colosseum or a new amphitheater or a new bath. It's a way of commemorating, in this case, the great military movements of the 1790s, essentially Napoleon and the Republic fighting its way out of the Reign of Terror. Continuing through all this, though, remember, he's at war with the United Kingdom and Russia, allied with Italian and German states, the Habsburg Empire of Austria and Spain. So much of the art, much of the Renaissance and Baroque and Rococo art that we have talked about, with the exception of England, is now Napoleonic territory, is now French. But just like any other king of France, his family, his sister, Pauline, is married quite advantageously to a prince in Italy, a Borghese, a very prominent Italian family. And his favorite sculptor is Antonio Canova. So hopefully you can hear the Italian in his name. So this wonderful sculpture, now that the Borghese Palace is a public museum, gets plenty of visitors. At the time, though, you can imagine Mr. Borghese was not so happy because Canova, again, court sculptor, gave Pauline what she wanted, and she explicitly asked to be sculpted in the nude as Venus, goddess of love. This is halfway to doing what a Roman empress would do. A Roman empress would have herself sculpted perhaps as Vesta or Juno, goddess of the hearth and home and wives and marriage, a paragon of motherhood and womanhood. Venus is, as you can see, a little risque. There she's holding in her left hand the golden apple that the young Paris awards Venus as the most beautiful goddess. This is, in a way, Pauline's love letter to herself. So I think we can at one point celebrate her chutzpah, her confidence, and also maybe shake our heads a little bit at poor Mr. Borghese, the prince, who really hides this away and only allows certain people to see it in certain conditions, never in full light, for fear of the art mimicking reality or vice versa, because there were a couple rumors about Pauline's behavior as well. So again, in terms of neoclassical style, this is a bit of a departure. Canova is another one of those artists like David who straddle the two worlds, the 18th and 19th centuries, the neoclassical and the romantic. And what's really going on here between Pauline Borghese as Venus and Kaufmann's painting of Cornelia is a very different status and public expression of female status here. One of very high-ranking, essentially an empress or an emperor's sister. The other, a woman, a mother of the Republic. So perhaps you can see again, we need to think of the 19th century brand of neoclassical as imperial, as very motivated toward the Caesars and not the Roman Republic, which was very much more about sacrificing for the community, for the people of Rome. As Cornelia demonstrates, her treasures are her children, who grow up to be heroes of the Republic. Pauline Borghese's sculpture is also a great example to what was happening in America. The previous chapter ends with this rather curious sculpture of George Washington on the right. You can see that there's definitely a limit. There's a threshold that you can reach with the neoclassical style, with mimicking the Romans and antique art, because nudity to a Roman would not be quite so taboo. In fact, there were nude sculptures, gilded, covered in gold, of the emperors in ancient Rome. So they wouldn't bat an eye at a bare-chested Washington. And yet in 1840 in the Americas, oh geez, that was much too Roman, too antique. They've gone too far. Think of it as kind of the uncanny valley when we're watching a television show or a movie, right? There's a certain length that we are prepared to go to believe the story, believe the plot, believe the CGI. And every now and then, there's something that pulls you back out of it and really takes you out of the story. And I think the bare chest of Washington and the nude Pauline Borghese definitely are artworks that do not get across that uncanny valley successfully. Yet, nudity is not a blanket problem. There are reclining female nudes all over the walls of the Academy. And from now on, when we say Academy, notice I have a picture of our own Cleveland Museum of Art. I don't just mean the one founded in 1648 under the rule of Louis XIV. I mean the art establishment. So the academies of Paris, the academies in London, in Italy, anywhere where artists are trained, where artists are judged, critiqued, museums, even Tri-C, you could say, is part of the Academy. I, yours truly, am part of the Academy as someone who teaches. With teaching comes rules, right? I mean, there are rules that I have to follow, you have to follow. So the problem is, well, how do you set down these rules? You look to the ancients, right? You look to, let's see, who are some names that might ring a bell? Vitruvius, Leonardo, Vasari, Michelangelo. There are all sorts of greats, particularly from the Renaissance, that the Academy looks to. But there are two, remember, Poussin and Rubens. Those who prefer to think of painting especially as rooted in structure and line and the classical side of the Renaissance, Poussinists. And those who revel in color and the emotional, expressive, dramatic side of the Baroque, Rubenists. With a change in century comes a shift. In the early days of the 18th century, so the 1700s, the Rococo style, Watteau, Fragonard, they are all Rubenist. They are all colorists. But this one, Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres, just call him Ingres if you need to, is definitely Poussiniste. He is someone that has a clarity of line and form and composition. In this painting, which is 12 by 16, a very standard salon or academic size for history painting. And despite that size, he wanted to actually fill this with more people, if you can imagine that. But he stopped, where we have a very clear-cut classical composition complete with Greek temple, centered on Homer, the bard, the artist credited, the poet credited with setting down the Iliad and the Odyssey, the great Greek epic poems of the ancient world. So this is a little bit of Ingres mimicking Raphael and his School of Athens. So this is an imaginary space, this pictorial space, where he's gathered these heroes of literature, of art and science, and put them together, almost as a means of saying, these are the greats, or the sovereign minds, I believe he says. This is his hall of fame, essentially, with Homer at the center. And apotheosis means, essentially, in Greek, becoming God. So he is rising. This is his rising. And you can see he is crowned by an allegorical winged figure. If it were a Roman emperor, it would be the goddess Victory. But in this case, we have a couple different personifications because of the very particular subject matter that Angra has picked. So you have Victory, but I believe the book also says Fame, which I think is maybe perhaps more, makes more sense for an artist, a poet, right? Crowning him with the laurels. And down at his feet, actually, are two more very important figures that kind of occupy the two works, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So they are there to remind us of those two great works that he is given credit for. Some other people to note, Poussin himself. Oops. Let's go back there. Let's see, Voltaire over here. Over here we have Phidias, a great Greek artist. And perhaps most notably, Raphael himself. And Angra is a big fanboy of Raphael. So remember, take a look at School of Athens here. This was Raphael's version of this pictorial space filled with the sovereign geniuses of the ancient world, centered on not Homer, but Aristotle and Plato. So together, we get a sense of how Angra perceived of this composition. This is essentially a quotation, a mimicking of the Renaissance master. And it's a continuation of neoclassical imagery that would suit the Napoleonic setting of the time. It also pertains to the greatness not only of the Greeks, but also of France, because of the inclusion of both French writers and painters. So it is a way of saying we have reached a point of cultural hegemony, if I can throw a big Greek word out at you. Essentially, cultural dominance. The aspects of romanticism here that Angra is just beginning to push out are the imaginary pictorial space, kind of the pooling together of all these people from many different time periods, from the ancient to the recent, and the idea of allegory. In essence, the metaphor, too, is an aspect of romanticism that has an impact on the viewer and is not just about linear style and the classical setting and the symmetry, which, of course, he ticks off all the boxes that Raphael demonstrates above. Perhaps the easiest way to understand Angra's shift from neoclassical to romanticism is to look at his Grand Odalisque. So this quarrel, this fight between the two sides, color versus line, is one that influences how the artists paint, because depending on where your teacher stands, depending on where the judges of the salon stand, if they are Poussiniste, they are going to give the grand prize, right, to somebody like Angra, one who has a great linear composition with a very sharp contrast and contour on Grand Odalisque here. The thing is, remember, classical. Does she look classical to you? Does she look Greek or Roman? What is an odalisque? It's a French term that translates essentially to Turkish harem girl or Turkish slave. This is where the colonialism and the fetishizing of Eastern cultures comes in. As Napoleon works his way through Syria, as more news comes from Egypt and the farther reaches of the Ottoman Empire, this is really the product of a Frenchman's imagination, not necessarily witnessing people in those eastern parts of the world, but imagining what they might look like based on story, based on fabrics and other arts that come from that place. So we have a couple very telltale Eastern things: the hookah on the right and the wrap on the odalisque's head. And that's about it. Everything else could fit in a lovely painting such as Venus of Urbino. If we look especially at the close-up here, we have such a great attention to detail. The shine of each pearl, of each gold thread. We can see her as essentially a descendant, the next step from Titian's Venus. But look, that hair part, the style of the nose and the little lips, those are also, remember he's a fanboy, Raphael-esque features that Raphael used to paint the Virgin Mary herself. And I'm doing this on purpose because look, we have European, European, European in skin tone, in bone structure, in all ways of form. This is a European or Caucasian woman, a white woman, not a woman you would find in Turkey, in Syria, in Egypt necessarily, where we would maybe expect darker skin, where we would expect a greater variety of facial type and body type. So this is definitely Ingres taking a Renaissance woman and putting her in the guise of a very romantic, as in imaginary, and exotic idea of the type of person that the great French army might be coming into contact with. Another way of thinking about this is that it's very mannerist. This is Ingres sacrificing a little bit of naturalism. If you especially look at the back, the curve of it, and how there seems to be at least a few extra vertebrae in there. It's very long and not necessarily muscled in a way that denotes an artist who has studied anatomy, or at least not an artist who is interested in using the study of anatomy. So she's much more akin to Parmigianino's Madonna with the long neck, where we have curves and lengthening of body proportions to establish a mood of elegance. So she has these kind of rubbery, boneless, muscleless arms, and kind of an impossible pose in general if we look again at where her hips and legs meet, and also the twist of her left leg to get over on top of her right leg. If we zoom in, we can see that everything from the smoke out of the hookah to the shine of the fabric and the peacock feathers gets this lovely treatment, except the feet. Oh, excuse me. We have a sense of roundness, but a lack of warmth. She's almost more mannequin-like than a real person. She's airbrushed in our kind of modern parlance. She is to be looked at and to be enjoyed as a work of art in and of herself. So when I say fetishize, that's what I mean. Objectification, made to be enjoyed, often in an erotic or sexual manner, by the French public. Now, that type of painting would be acceptable in terms of its execution. I think that the subject would be a little borderline. What really would get on the nerves of the Academy is someone like Eugène Delacroix. He is the color to Ingres line. He's Rubeniste. He uses the Mortician-esque colorito in building up his paintings and his compositions with that lovely red that you see throughout here, the death of Sardanapalus, that kind of unifies the whole composition, even though it's actually showing a quite chaotic and messy scene. What the Rubenistes really focus on is not sort of stoic, classical finery, but expression. And especially with Delacroix, we can think of him as a bit of a rebel, not just in terms of art, but also as he covers more current events and political events of the day. He, in many ways, sides with the rebels, for example, the 1830 Revolution. In this case, he's showing us the more romantic side influenced by literature. So the death of Sardanapalus, or the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal, comes from writing of Lord Byron, so a contemporary of Delacroix, an Englishman who writes poetry and composes based on the ancient world, everything that you might think goes along with the apotheosis of Homer, except for the fact that we're focusing on the Assyrian rather than the Greek side of the ancient world. And it is brutal. Essentially, this is the final scene where Ashurbanipal has been defeated. The enemies are literally at the gates. And instead of letting his enemy have all of his riches, he decides to destroy his possessions, which include his harem, his concubines, his women, and his horses on the left. Everything is essentially being done away with so that the victors cannot have any spoils. Brutal. Speaks to, again, a very Eurocentric idea of how Ashurbanipal would have been like. And as well, if we bring up perhaps another artist who reveled in being a rebel and showing off violence, remember Gentileschi's work with Judith slaying the Assyrian Holofernes. She uses the tenebrism of the Baroque to focus in, so we have one moment versus a plethora of moments that Delacroix gives us. So that helps to focus our mind, particularly on the rather feminist topic that she has picked, and a rather unfeminist and one might even say uncivilized topic that Delacroix is showing off here. I wouldn't say, though, that Delacroix is celebrating this moment. This is meant to, I think, instill horror, disgust, shame, especially when you look at the king himself. Amid all of this violence, amid, you can imagine, the women crying for mercy as his favorite throws herself upon his bed. Look at Ashurbanipal, Sardanapalus there. He just can't be bothered. It's that contrast there, I think, of this kind of still, quiet moment of the king versus all the clamor around him that is the real emotional crux of the painting. That's why I think we can not pile too much of colonialism on top of Delacroix, we can recognize what's going on through the work of Lord Byron and Delacroix's interpretation of that work, but also that it is fictional. This is coming from people who did not necessarily understand the Assyrian culture to the level that we do today, and it was meant to instill emotions that wouldn't necessarily have been evoked by a more scientific or objective take on the culture. Delacroix, he appreciated, he reveled in the kind of growing French Empire, where he was able to find other people, not just rosy-cheeked Putti and Venuses that he would actually make fun of. In his words, in places like Algeria, Northern Africa, Egypt, Syria, beauty abounds here, not in the overpraised beauty of fashionable paintings like Ingres. The heroes of David and co., with their rose-pink limbs, would cut a sorry figure beside these children of the sun. So here with Tiger Hunt, this is far afield from a European or a Greco-Roman topic or subject matter, both geographically and in terms of its scope. It's not some hero, it's not some king or some Roman emperor. It is, in its essence, man versus beast, man versus wild. And this is the smaller salon size here, about 2 by 3. So Odalisque is also this small. For 12 by 16, it has to be a history painting, like Sardanapalus. This is a smaller category of painting, but even so, even at that scale, you can see the brushwork, where Ingres kind of hid every brushstroke in the illusion of texture. Delacroix delights in showing you where he's applied the blue, where he's applied the green, and of course, that brilliant pop of red to the right-hand side. To the extent that the tiger that is rearing up to bite the horse, we barely get a sense of that actual violence because we're looking at the form of the tiger constructed out of these brushes and splotches of orange. The sky on the far right is basically just messy canvas, which is how the Academy would have seen it. Colorito here is not classical. It is not heroic. It is not rational. The emotional pull, the expressiveness of this would not have been strange to the Academy. They would have recognized perhaps Rubens in it. They would, though, have rejected it for it not fitting Poussin's great Greek manner that David would continue, that Ingres also had continued in terms of each annual salon. It's one last look here. Pretty much almost the same scale here in terms of size of painting. We have dramatic brushwork versus essentially invisible brushwork. The hand of the artist on one side and a lack thereof on the other. And that's what the Academy accepted. The meticulous application of oil paint so that you can't really see the brush strokes. And of course, everyone would have to be varnished over. With oil paint, you can rework and add to it almost over years. You can work on an oil painting because of how slowly oil paint can dry. But in the Academy, they would have a very particular day where everybody chose to say, that's enough, I'm going to apply the varnish layer so that it can be judged, so it can go into the annual salon and be chosen for the grand prize, perhaps. So remember, this is a rebel versus someone following the rules, following the traditions. in terms of where that really connects to our modern world, think for a minute that these events of the late 18th and 19th centuries, for example, 1792 and the volunteers, the army of France, this essentially is an allegory, a personification of the French national anthem, the Marseillaise, on the side of the Arc de Triomphe by Francois Rude. This is their Statue of Liberty, which, remember, is also a gift from France. So for them, for the French people, Frenchness, modern Frenchness, is embodied by a liberty who is clad in battle gear, holding a sword, and urging on heroic French soldiers who are accompanied, remember these are nudes, they are personifications, not actual nude French soldiers, like honor and courage. That's what they represent and personify. Liberty, in the American version, much later in the century, has become calmer. She is more mature, you might say. She's no longer fighting. But in 1792, this was a warlike liberty. And again in 1830, a liberty who would run through the streets of Paris with a musket and the tricolor flag. We are, during this romantic period, at the same time artists are lost in their own thoughts, and poetry and literature and music, we're looking at the formation of not just modern but 20th century nations, ideas of global political divisions, as not only England and France and Germany chop up places like Africa and Asia for their own economic uses, but America too joins in exploring the globe. Maybe the best way we can put it, exploiting the globe is what really happens. So for us, artistically, how was Napoleon influential? Remember, he favors the neoclassical, and it's evident in the artists he chooses. And what I just ended with, how does Romanticism relate to colonialism? And why was there a quarrel in the Academy? Think of the roots of it. It goes back to Leonardo versus Michelangelo, right? Or Raphael versus Titian. It goes back to classical versus Baroque. This idea that there's always opposition. That Romanticism, in a way, is a reaction to the neoclassical.